I will leave my thanks for the end, and with one exception, I'd like to thank Elizabeth Traugott for helping to bring me to Stanford 28 years ago. And it was my privilege not too long after that to write one of my first joint publications with her. And we have another publication that should be coming out, hopefully, sometime next year. I think I both added them to my, my list of references. I couldn't really find a way to work them into my talk, so let me tell you at the beginning that they're there and explain why. I think I'll also depart from German tradition and give you my structure after the talk rather than before, and just go straight to 3 questions that I want to start with. Starting first with my key question, how, meaning for a variationist or a good quantitative sociolinguist, how often and with what linguistic conditioning or constraints do Creole and vernacular English speakers in Guyana, Jamaica, Appalachia, and African America, a term I like, omit that, who, what, in relative clauses like I saw the boy, that, who, what, you like. So my interest is in the 0 variant, often referred to these days as relativizer omission. Now, from quantitative studies of the last 10 to 20 years, we know a lot about this variable in various British and American varieties. Not as many vernacular varieties as we'd like, but still quite a few. But really nothing, nada, zilch about this in Caribbean Creole English or any of the other varieties that I just mentioned. So that's why I wanted to talk about that today. But in looking at this phenomena, we are led to a second larger question. Can the patterns of relativizer omission in these vernacular varieties contribute any new insights to the old debate about the Creole versus English origins of African American vernacular English? Now, for instance, if the Black African American vernacular English patterns, like Caribbean Creole Englishes, that is, if Av looks like Caribbean Creole Englishes in relativizer omission, speakers of Caribbean English were well represented in the founding populations of Black English speakers in the American colonies, while the white Appalachian speakers behave more like English speakers in Ulster and other northern British areas from which the ancestors of today's Appalachians came, we might conclude that the Creolists are right. And I said here, hooray, for America, I would say woohoo, but I wasn't sure you would understand that. And we might say more generally that this case confirms Lebov's more general claim that quantitative patterns can apparently preserve linguistic history over several centuries and several continents. But this brings me then to my third question, which I call the mother of all questions, at least the mother of all my questions for today, which is whether the variable patterns for relativizer omission are specific enough to particular dialects or regions that we can use them reliably to reconstruct historical relations from these cross-variety comparisons, or whether they in fact begin to reflect broader processing constraints that might be found in all Englishes, if not universally. So we'll work our way up to those 3 questions. I guess you can think of that as my structure, and let's start to look at relativizer omission. But I wanted to just give you a sense that it's part of a larger project where we're looking at this variable, we're looking at plural marking, and we're looking at question formation, subject auxiliary inversion, which I've seen in several papers. I can't get to all of them, but I wish I could, in several different varieties. I sometimes wonder as I toil away in the day and night how I ended up with 5 varieties and 3 variables, but I think the National Science Foundation had its own wisdom about what additional things I should be looking at. So we don't have a Barbadian Creole English data yet, but we do have the others. Okay, so let's maybe get on to relativizers. So just to give a little background, English restrictive relative clauses, the ones that are enclosed in square brackets in the overhead, restricted denotation, as Huddleston and Pullum put it, of an antecedent NP, the ones on the line below, and may be introduced in one of 3 ways. So by a plus or minus human WH pronoun, like who or which, I saw the boy who you like. I saw the ball which you like. By that, as in I saw the boy or ball that you like. Or by zero, I saw the boy or ball you like. So excluded from this variation are non-restrictive relative clauses where the antecedent is already uniquely denoted. These often have, as many of you know, comma pronunciation and can be introduced only by WH pronouns. So I saw Mary, whom you like. Now, there's a little variation there, but generally that's true. So following Schachter, 1985, and many recent works on this variable, we'll refer to these variants as relativizers. Now, let me say a bit about some of the early studies and generalizations here. So at least since the 1960s and 1970s, a number of descriptive and generative linguists have noted the variation between these relativizers and made informal observations about them and the factors that seem to favor, in particular, the zero variant. So an early generalization is that standard or mainstream English allows this kind of omission, the zero variant, only with object relativizers, as in 1D, I saw the boy who you like, and not with subject relativizers, as in 3, I saw the boy likes you. But of course, we know already there's a number of English dialects like Appalachian, African American English, some Scottish, Irish, and English varieties, among others, do allow some omission of subject relativizers, as in this sentence from Tagliamonte et al.'s 2005 paper, there were a boy in Ballyclar told me this. But in general, this feature is less common than object relativizer omission, and the constraint patterns, that is what favors, what disfavors omission, are somewhat different. Now, quantitative studies of relativizer variation, especially omission in English, which often reveal constraints that the non-quantitative studies had missed, have been done since the 1980s, probably beginning with Romain, 1982, Kai et al., 1987. They've become really a lot more common since the 1990s. And in recent years have attracted generativists as well as sociolinguists, and people who are interested in the purely syntactic or processing constraints on this variation, including Lehmann and Wassau, Wichmann, 2008. Now, among the factors that both the sociolinguists and the generativists have found significant are the structure of the matrix sentence, whether it's an existential, a cleft, a possessive sentence, the adjacency of the relativizer to the head or antecedent noun phrase, whether it's adjacent or not, how long the relative clause is, and whether the head or antecedent noun phrase is definite or human or not. Okay? We'll come back to those. We'll come back to those factors. Now, so I mean, why do we care about relativizer omission, and why is it relevant to the debate about the Creole origins of African American vernacular English? And I think that's because primarily over the past decade, relativizer omission has been added to the evidence of copular absence and other variables in the debate over the Creole origins of Av. So this was particularly done by Totti and Ray, 1997, and Totti and Harvey, 2000. And those of us who've labored long in the copular, I don't want to say graveyard, but, you know, pardon? Trenches, right. So delighted to see something else. We said, this looks nice and new, we got to get into this. And it's also a syntactic variable, which in general, variationist studies tend to do less often, at least tend to have done less often in the past than morphological and phonological variants. Now, Totti and Harvey, 2000, looking at relativizer omission data from early African American English, which is a term they use for recordings of United States former slaves, ex-slaves, people who were interviewed and recorded in the 1930s and so on, and descendants of African Americans who went to Nova Scotia in Canada or Samana in the Dominican Republic, as we know from the work of Sally Tagliamonte and Shauna Poplack. In the early 19th century, in looking at this work, Totti and Harvey conclude that these varieties descend from English rather than Creole stock, since they seem to have constraints similar to those of English dialects. But this study, while I think it was a very welcome pioneering study, and it certainly got the rest of us interested in the variable, was limited in three respects. One, which had nothing at all to do with the authors, was the fact that there were absolutely no quantitative studies of relativizer omission in Anglophone or any other Creoles to compare the early African-American English findings to. Indeed, of the 10 variables that are considered in Shauna Poplack's 2000 book, The English History of African-American English, there's really only existing quantitative data on 2 of them, plural marking and copular absence. So, as I said, it's certainly not their fault, but without this kind of data, one could not conclude that relativizer omission in early African-American English looks more like English than Creole, because we have no idea what the Creole pattern looks like. Moreover, the corpora to which they turned to get to early African-American vernacular English yielded very few tokens of restrictive clauses. And again, I really say very strongly, this is not their fault, because those of us who've worked in this variable know that relativizer omission is no TD deletion. If you're doing TD deletion, you can listen to somebody for 10 minutes and you've got 100 examples. If you're doing relativizer omission, you pray and you hope that they will want to restrict the reference of some noun phrase so you can get an example to include in your corpus. And then every now and again you find a speaker who for some strange reason just bubbles with relativizers, and you want to use them again and again and again, but you can't, of course, do that. So it's very hard to get the amount of data you need, and a lot of the quantitative distributions that they then ended up with didn't give them enough kind of oomph to really make the statistical point. So they didn't have enough tokens for variable rule analysis, especially the multivariate analysis that could kind of simultaneously keep track of all the different factors that are being considered. So hence the need for this study. So let me tell you a bit about the data that we've used. The Guyanese data come primarily from informal spoken interviews, generally 1 to 3 hours long, made by myself, with cane cutters, weeding gang women, shop owners, and other interesting people from a village that I call Cane Walk, and also from Georgetown between 1975 and 1982. And I supplemented them by some more recent recordings made for Don Winford by students from the University of Guyana in 1991. The Jamaican data come from 2 sources. One are informal spoken recordings made between 1991 and 2006. Some of these are sociolinguistic interviews, most conducted by native speakers. Others, including some material I've only gotten over the last year, including arguments in public or on the air. And this is from some wonderful work by Catherine Shields Broadber, who has a kind of material that most of us don't get into. But basically, whenever she hears people arguing, she records them. Sometimes I think she tries to go early in the argument and get permission. At other times, she records them and then asks them right afterwards if she can get permission to use it. Curiously enough, a lot of the domestic disputes, she seems to get permission readily from the women who say, let the world know what a terrible man this guy was, I'm not sure she always has permission from the men, but anyhow. And then there's this wonderful collection of stories in a book called Lionheart Gyal. Actually, I left out the palatalization here. Lionheart Gyal, produced by the Sisterin Collective with Anna Ford Smith, which is a collection of oral narratives with Jamaican women, which was first linguistically analyzed by Peter Patrick et al. In 1993. And some of the students from Freiburg who were down in Jamaica this summer had the privilege of looking at these texts and helping to extract relativizers and so on. So we found that the patterns in these 2 subsets were very similar, and it allowed us to kind of augment our data. The African-American vernacular English data are primarily from informal recordings and interviews with working class speakers in East Palo Alto, California, conducted by community insiders like Faye McNair Knox and her daughter, Rashida Knox. Interestingly enough, Faye McNair Knox is African-American, but when her family moved to East Palo Alto when she was very young, about 10. And she, given that her father was a minister, was really not a fluent speaker of African-American vernacular English. But she said she started getting beaten up every day And she rapidly learned that speaking African-American vernacular English was one way to kind of survive. So she became a speaker herself, and her daughter was reared in this community, so she is a native speaker. So she's been one of my greatest assistants, particularly in the fieldwork department. And the Appalachian data come from two sources, West Virginia recordings made in the 1970s by Wolfram and his associates, and then recordings with other speakers, older speakers in Beach Bottom, North Carolina, made by a number of people, and I was really surprised to listen to the tape and hear Danny Schreier as one of the interviewers in 2001. So I'm very grateful to them for giving me access to those materials, so I didn't have to add going out to Appalachia to all the other things I had to do for this project. So what we did is we went through these tapes looking for these rare relativizers, rare restrictive relative clauses, and we extracted every single example we could find, and then we coded them for this whole string of variables we were considering. We followed pretty much the model of Tagliamonte et al. 2005, and Totti and Harvey 2000, in excluding incomplete relative clauses, adverbial relatives, with sentences with is copulars, and so on and so forth. And then we used the variable rule program to assess the significant constraints and compare the results to quantitative studies of other varieties. For instance, the spoken corpus analyzed by Couch 2002, who I was hoping to meet here, but I haven't seen here. So, including the WPA, Hoodoo, and other samples of earlier African-American English. And then we compared them with the Northern Irish, Scottish, and English varieties that were analyzed by Tagliamonte et al. Okay, so I've already said a bit about this. I wouldn't have to beat this to death, but for each variable, we would look at the variance, whether it was subject or non-subject, the structure of the sentence, length of the clause, and so on. Let me maybe take you to some specific examples. So here's some non-subject examples from Jamaica. There's nothing a woman can do which a man can do. Now, I'm not here to argue the content of this sentence. I don't share the same opinion. I wouldn't be able to go home tonight if I said this. But Jack, who's a Jamaican farmer, said this in an interview that Andrew and I did some years ago. So obviously we have a zero form. It's a non-subject. Relativizer is existential sentence. There's nothing. It's long, using the criterion that Tagliamonte et al. Established, about 3 words, greater than 3 words is long. I think we have a sense that we want to go back and revisit this because there's so many dimensions of length that seem to get left out, but has an indefinite pronoun antecedent. The relativizer is adjacent to the noun phrase, it's right next to it, has a non-human antecedent, and is singular. And then we pick up the other relativizer there, same thing, there's nothing a woman can do, which a man can do, right? And here it's non-subject again. In this case, the relativizer, which is of course no longer adjacent to its head, nothing, because it's separated by that other relative clause. So let me give you subject examples from Guyana so that my country people don't feel slighted. So here's the first sentence, 6A. Me got one brother live at Enmore. I have a brother who lives at Enmore. Again, zero form, there's a relativizer, subject, possessive sentence structure. And we found very often that what we had to do is restrict our possessives to true possessives. There are many apparently possessive structures, they got a lot of people, which aren't really possessive, they're really existential. And those of you who were talking about existential sentences this afternoon know that. So we would in fact classify those sentences, even though they used a possessive verb, as existentials. And then let me give you this other sentence over here, a beautiful sentence, Adawa mise, okay? It occurs in the context of a discussion about zombies or ghosts. And so these two women were saying, well, there really couldn't be ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts, I don't see them. And then one said, well, if ghosts really existed, they would go into the bank and withdraw money. This would probably be a good time for them to do that. And the other one said, well, adawa misa, mina believe pan goes, pan jambi, okay? So here we have wa. This is the relativizer that's kind of like what in some dialectal forms of English, unmarked for human, non-human. It's a subject, this clef sentence structure, which isn't, I hope Pullum is not going to lead me into a long discussion of whether we should include these in discussions of relativizer omissions. There are a lot of reasons not to, but it's a structure that has been included in many previous discussions of it, and for that reason we wanted to include it. And again, it's short, definite pronoun, adjacent, non-human, and so on. Okay, so this is a quick word about verb rule. It's a logistic regression computer program that calculates the significance or the insignificance of factor groups towards rule application. So in other words, every time you look at a display of verb rule results, there are two things you're really looking for. Of all the factor groups or categories of constraints that you're looking at, which ones are significant? Which groups or which features make a difference? So maybe length makes a difference, maybe length doesn't make a difference. Maybe having a human antecedent or a non-human antecedent makes a difference. Is the factor group as a whole significant? And verb rule helps to tell you that. And then within each factor group, it estimates the probability or weight of each factor's contribution to the rule. So probabilities or factor weights that are greater than 0.5 favor rule application. So in our case, we're running our programs as though the variant we're looking at is 0. So any figures that you see greater than 0.5 favor the emergence of 0, and those lower than 5 disfavor it, and they favor the retention of some kind of relativizer, and those at or around 0.5 have no effect in either direction. Okay, so let's go on, first of all, just to look at the distribution of relativizers in Jamaican data. We see all the variants on the left, and we'll just look at the subject variants first. And it's kind of interesting. They're kind of evenly spread out, okay? It's almost like they said, okay, let's split this up 4 ways, and 0 will take 25%. We highlighted the form that's most frequent, but I'm sure it's not even statistically most frequent, 28% for who or which. In the non-subject category, we have a very clear winner, 56% of the time. 0 is the favored form, okay? Or non-form, if you wish, all right? And I guess much as Tagliamonte et al. Found, who or which is a very marginal form, just 2% of the time it occurs, okay? And wa, or we, is the second most frequent form at 29%. The other thing that should be noted, I guess, while we're up here, of course, is that 25% is a pretty high rate so far as absence of subject relativizers is concerned. Remember, this is something that's normally not even allowed in most English varieties. Okay, so let's look now. You have this on your handout. I know this wouldn't necessarily be that clear for all of you to see. But if we just focus on the subject relativizers and we look at all the varieties, you'll see first Jamaican, Guyanese, earlier African-American English, African-American Vernacular English, so-called black varieties. And then below that, Appalachian, Lowland Scotland, Northwest England, Northern Ireland, so-called white varieties. And I say so-called because, primarily, most of these speakers are either black or white, but if you go to the Caribbean, you'll find all kinds of Chinese, Portuguese, all kinds of people speaking deep Creole. And then in terms of Appalachia, in fact, our second daughter married the grandchild of a black Appalachian coal miner. He spent 50 years working in the mines and had, black lung disease and everything like any other Appalachian. So that's a whole other story to be told. We actually have some black Appalachians in our data, and because of how NSF wanted us to approach it, we've so far kept them out of our discussion. But I'm itching to get to look at them and see what they're doing. Okay, so again, looking across, we can see the data we saw for Jamaican. Guyanese has just gone crazy so far as the 0 Relativizer is concerned. They're using 47% for their null forms. Early African American English has about 18. Modern Av has about 12. Actually, that's the lowest of the group. Appalachian has about 46, and so on and so forth. Just to look in the main column, I don't want to go through all these details. In the main column here with that, you can see that definitely is the favorite form for most varieties. Again, Jamaican has a slight edge for who or which. And then looking at the non-subject relativizers, you can see that the null form is the favorite form for all the varieties. The frequencies vary. Appalachian comes out on top here, 77%. And Northern Ireland has probably the least in that group. That is a favorite form for Northwest England and Northern Ireland. And who, as Tagliamonte emphasized, is pretty marginal. Okay? Interestingly enough, though, the WA form or the WIF form is very strong, remains very, very strong in the Caribbean, 29% and 27%. And early African American English has quite a sizable chunk given its status. Okay, so since you handled that so well, I thought you would handle this quite easily. And you have this on your handout. So let me just turn here for a second and just make a couple points. Remember I was saying, so these are variable rule results then. We've extracted all the examples, we've fed them into the computer, and the program has told us basically two things, like I promised you. It says, you know, let's look at the Guyanese data, and it says, well, there are two significant factor groups, and these are the ones that we have shaded here, right? So the sentence structure is significant for Guyanese, and the plurality of the antecedent, which people haven't really looked at before, but my assistant, a collaborator, as we were looking at the data, kept feeling that plurality was significant, and it turned out to be significant for Guyanese, okay? So the two shaded boxes tell us which of these factors or factor groups was significant. Now, the ones that aren't shaded were non-significant, and the data in those are enclosed in square brackets. And you'll see in many cases, for instance here, adjacent, non-adjacent, it's around 0.509, this is 0.411. There's not much of a spread between them, and they're both around that middle 0.5 point that doesn't make that much difference, okay? Just to go back, since we're staying in the Guyanese area, if my shading and my bolding worked well, the bold figures are the ones that favor the zero. Okay, so it tells you that when you have an existential sentence, 0.776, that highly favors it. Possessive highly favors it. Clef sentences, we had to almost come up with our own way of representing it. This is what you call a knockout factor. It was so favorable that we had to remove it from the analysis because it applied 100% of the time, and there really was no variation there. That is, we didn't want to drag all these other factors through the analysis because every time the program detected a clef sentence, it was 100%. And so whatever accidental associations you had with these other factors were irrelevant. And then anything that was not one of these sentences disfavored the rule, okay? Here, singular favored at 0.616, plural favored at 0.322. We still haven't figured out exactly why that variable works the way it does. And we have almost no data on that for most of the features. Okay, so going across, you can see that sentence structure was favorable for most of the groups. Length of relative clause was favorable for most of the white varieties, and so on and so forth. You can continue looking at your table in your chapter, and let me just use my PowerPoint here to make some more general points. When we look at sentence structure, I think this is a nice candidate for a variety-independent processing constraint. Okay, since the existentials, as we say, favor zero in all the varieties, and the clefs and the possessives seem to favor zero in most of them. Length, as I said, is significant on the right side of the table in all the white varieties. and in none of the black varieties. Antecedent type is significant in all but one of the black varieties and insignificant in all but one of the white varieties. But then again, I make a little qualification because in neither African American English nor Jamaican does an indefinite NP favor 0. And very often people find indefinite NPs to favor 0. And then we only, in the course of this project, began to look at superlative or unique NPs, like best and only. And I don't think Sally and Gunnell were looking at that when they did their studies, so that these would have been tucked into the definite noun phrase. And when you extract them, so these are the cases where you say, the ugliest man, the only person, as against, the man, the person. And those have a very powerful effect, which a number of other people have noticed. So adjacencies are washed out for everybody. So after all the big hullabaloo that everybody makes about adjacency, none of our speakers really cares. And I think that's because there are other factors operating that are much more powerful for them. Humanness, significant only in Jamaican, but then again, we have a lot of cases where we have no data. And then plurality is significant only in Jamaican or Guyana. So overall, there's really no absolutely clear pattern, but if anything, I would say African American and vernacular English looks more like Jamaican and less like the white varieties on the right. And, I mean, you have this in front of you. So African American vernacular English here certainly does not seem to be a British variety in the same sense that people might have said it earlier. So let's look at the non-subject relativizer cases over here. Again, the shadings and so on mean the same thing, okay? So here you can see sentence structures significant for both on the black side of the table and the white side of the table. Length is significant for the white varieties, type of antecedent for the black varieties. And adjacency finally makes a showing in a couple of the black varieties, Jamaican and Av, as though they heard me murmuring to myself just now that maybe Av looked like Jamaican. So they said, yes, look at this. And then humanness is interesting. In fact, what's interesting here, and it's a point I make actually in the next slide, is that here, the Yankee varieties say, look, we are special. So whether they're black or white, if they're on the American shelf, so to speak, then they all show an effect of non-human over human, okay? So I'm going over that pretty fast, but I can't tell you how much work it takes to get to that table, okay? So I wish you could have a sense of the toil that they have to go through to get each of those bits of data and then do the runs and so on and so forth. So here I just summarize what I was saying. Guyanese and Jamaican look more similar to lowland Scots and northwest England, with a favoring effect of cleft and existential, which is not the case in Jamaican, and a disfavoring effect of possessive. Length is significant in all the British varieties and none of the others, okay? Antecedent type is insignificant for all the British varieties, but significant for all the black ones, with superlative noun phrase most favorable for all 4 varieties. But then again, we just try to get data on this. Adjacencies are washed out for all the white varieties, significant for 2 of the black ones, and antecedent humanness is significant only in American varieties. Plurality is insignificant for all 3 varieties, but again, we've just really started to look at this. From Beeman's paper yesterday, Weichman, I'm sorry, I should look at my notes first before I speak. I have another couple of variables to go back and add into my data, whether center embedding or right embedding. I think the beauty about this thing is that enough people have looked at it that we have all kinds of families of constraints that we could keep adding to our analysis. So overall, again, apart from a shared sentence structure constraint, the British varieties seem to be set off by themselves, and Av doesn't seem very similar to them. So what are our answers to questions 1 and 2? Well, the answers to question 1 is really contained in the details of tables 1 and 5, particularly 4 and 5, which have all the details of how these factors function in these varieties. In terms of question 2, The similarities and differences in these patterns between individual varieties and the black versus the white patterns do suggest partial answers to the question about the Creole origins debate. So I would say that there's certainly no evidence in these data for a British origin of African American English here. And African American English differs from Appalachian, even from Appalachian, with which it shares continental space. So there's some tantalizing resemblances between Av and the other black varieties, especially Jamaican, but I think these have to be balanced against similarities and differences on other variables before we can get any clear conclusions with respect to the Creole origins hypothesis. And as those of you who've been involved in the Creole origins hypothesis would, of course, know, people would say, well, wait a second, you can't jump to any conclusion just based on one variable or one type of evidence. You've got 6 or 7 different types of evidence to be considered. So what of question 3, which I think is actually the most interesting question right now. Well, Tagliamonte et al. Had really very commendably raised the question of whether some of the specific constraints of Relativizer Omission might be dialects specific, or whether they might represent a more general vernacular norm, or whether they might represent potentially universal cognitive processing constraints. I think their preliminary answers, while they were entirely plausible, may need revision as more data come in. For instance, they felt that the favoring effect of existentials might represent a shared vernacular norm, and they felt very plausibly that the length of the relative clause was a good candidate for a very general cognitive processing constraint. However, as we saw, length was totally irrelevant for all the black varieties of our speakers in our data. While the work of Tom Wassow, my colleague Tom Wassow and his associates, suggested the favoring effect of existentials on 0 might be, I think I have to call this an English versal. I was calling it an Anglo-versal. It sounded so wonderful until I came to realize that I guess what Christian originally meant was not just universals of English, but universals of the colonial Englishes. So that's a very particular type. So we're beginning to proliferate with the versals, but something that at present we might say we find in various varieties of English. So let me go on to talk a bit more about that, talking about Wassow's predictability hypothesis. So Wassow and his colleagues have been using a parse switchboard corpus based on 650 telephone conversations between strangers in the US. And from that, they got 3,701 non-subject relative clauses. Now, those of us who have to toil away with tape recordings wish we could just kind of throw our corpus net up and get this many cases. Anyhow, they had 47% with that and 57% with 0. Now, of course, Tom and his colleagues are only looking at non-subject relative clauses, where you get 0 as a very strong variant in American and British English regularly. And they came up with this predictability hypothesis, not necessarily framed in the clearest way initially, but they said that determiners, adjectives, and nouns that increase the likelihood of a following non-subject relative clause decrease the likelihood that the non-subject relative clauses following them will begin with relativizers. Okay, so I think I should do a little test to see if everybody can remember that immediately. So this has been reformulated slightly more, in a better form, I think, more recently. Basically, the more predictable a relative clause is, non-subject relative clause, the less likely it is to begin with that, okay? So I think about, I guess the analogy would be like, you know, the way, I guess the analogy I was trying to think of was peacocks or something in mating season, you know, who try to fan out their feathers and say, look at me, I'm a peacock, right? So we might think of relative clauses as needing to do something like this when they're less expected. They say, make a big fuss. Here's my that, here's my who, here's my whom. Look out, you're going to see me. But if I'm very, very much expected in this environment, then they don't need to do this. So the more likely that a relative clause, a noun phrase with certain characteristics is going to be followed by a relative clause, then the less likely you are to need a relativizer like that or any of the other forms to mark the beginning of that clause. So Yeager and Wassow in their most recent presentation said that this insight really came to them originally from a paper by Fox and Thompson, who noted that the sentence, "That was the ugliest pair of shoes I ever saw," sounds incomplete without a relative clause. You know, you come to somebody and said, "That was the ugliest pair of shoes." Okay? It's less likely than "That was the ugliest pair of shoes I ever saw." And also that if you do get the relative clause, you're most likely to get it without that. Okay? So they started to put that together and came up with their analysis. So what they found by looking at all kinds of noun phrases was that there was a very strong correlation between the occurrence of certain kinds of adjectives in a noun phrase. Note the examples: superlative or unique adjectives like best, only, first, and last, which commonly co-occurred with relative clauses, and the likelihood that they would occur with a zero relativizer. And so I don't want to flip back through all my slides, but going back to our tables 5 and 4, note how strongly this correlates with our data, that in general, whenever we have a strongly superlative noun phrase, we also get high rates of 0. Now, interestingly enough, Weechman, 2008, in his presentation yesterday, and I've just been hearing all kinds of interesting things at this conference that kind of feed very directly into my talk. Where's Weechman? Is he here tonight? There he is. Great. Yes, good, good. So I'm sorry to have butchered your name earlier, but I loved your analysis. Also reported that in his study, unique adjectives, these superlatives, best, worst, only, in the antecedent or head and noun phrase, were one of 3 elements that constituted what he called his type 1 relative clause constructions. And his model is an entrenchment model, and he finds that certain kinds of combinations of features are very highly associated with 0, and these become highly automatized and easier to process. So that accounts for that part of our data. Let's look briefly at existentials and clefs. So more recently, Wassow and Yeager, inspired by the evidence in Tagliamonte et al., looking at those northern varieties, the data in our tables on the right of the tables, inspired by their finding that existentials favored relative omission, a point that had been made by other people before, argued that there were good processing explanations for this and that their predictability hypothesis would account for it. So let me just give you some of the points they made in their recent presentation. So they said that in general, these kinds of existential constructions are presentational. They're used to introduce a new entity into the discourse. The introduction often involves some kind of additional background information, which is often provided in the form of a relative clause. So existential constructions very often end up having some kind of relative clause. And so they made 2 predictions from this, based on the trigger of Tagliamonte et al. They said that noun phrases and existentials and objects of have are likely to have high rates of relative clause modification. Now, they're likely to occur a lot of the time with relative clauses. And that these relative clauses are likely to have high rates of thatlessness too. Tested them with switchboard data, parse switchboard data, and here's their first prediction. Again, NPs and existentials will have high rates of, and objects of have will have high rates of modification. And this is what they found, that NPs and existentials had a 23.1% occurrence rate with relative clauses, have somewhat less, 9.2, but all other NPs only had 2.1%. So that first prediction was borne out. And then the second prediction, that they would have high rates of thatlessness or 0. Again, NPs and existentials, 85% without that. Objects of have or the possessives, 87% without that. And all other noun phrases, 55% without that. So that was also borne out there. Okay, so again, note the neat parallel with our tables 4 and 5, where existentials and to a lesser extent possessives favor high rates of relativizer omission almost across the board. Now, I think we still have a long way to go to figure out when and why particular data sets will conform to the predictability model. or to Weechman's entrenchment model, I think this can be affected by all kinds of things, from data size to the effect of other more powerful local constraints. And I should say that fully testing this model really requires computerized corpora. At present, we can't fully test this with our data because it means not only looking at every noun phrase with a relative clause, but looking at every noun phrase in the corpus, period. Okay? This has already taken us long enough. We can't look at every single noun phrase, right? So what we need to be able to do is have our data in a form where we can just plug the whole thing in, have a computer go in and have a parsed corpus, have a computer go in and pull out all the noun phrases, look at how often we get relative clauses, and then look at how often we get zero, okay? So we're a little far from that, and I hope I can have some more fruitful discussions with some of the people here at Freiburg about how we can do this, not just for the Aquilec, but for the deep basilectal varieties that a lot of us work with. But even though there are challenges involved in trying to get to a means of testing this kind of hypothesis, I personally feel that the prospects for work along these lines are exciting, even if, or perhaps because, they take us beyond these sectarian squabbles about the origins of African vernacular English and other varieties. Not to have you think I've gotten completely old and soft. I still like squabbles. Some of my colleagues here will remember that a couple years ago, I went to a conference and said I came to wage war, not peace. But after several more years of Bush, I guess I've changed my mind, and I want to join the peace movement, and Obama is rising, and so on and so forth. So I said here, wouldn't it be great if we could join forces and use the study of English creoles and vernaculars to learn more about language and what it's like to be human. So this is not a new idea, of course, in and of itself, but I think particularly at this conference, I have this sense that there's a kind of confluence of new data types, new kinds of data, not just intuitions and not just sentences spoken by, used in newspapers, 30 or 40 years ago, but data from all over the world, vernacular, non-vernacular, and so on. And this kind of confluence also of different kinds of analytic traditions. I think one of the things that I've enjoyed at this conference is going to hear kinds of papers that very often when I go to the LSA, I often don't hear because we do end up in our sociolinguistic and Creole enclaves and the generative enclaves and so on and so forth. And when I go to NWAVE, well, it's all of the stuff that I just do myself. So I think I have a sense that there's a lot of new kinds of data. There are a lot of different analytical approaches represented here. And I've begun to see this also in other recent conferences and publications. So the prospects for pursuing these kinds of questions and then being able to really disentangle the very general universal or at least English-versal constraints from the constraints that are specific to particular dialect groups, I think are a lot more promising now than they have been in the past several years. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take some questions.